This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras. I'm here with my co-host James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hello, Thomas.
And I like that serpentine head motion you did to access the mic there. We are in close quarters today because we are here in person with our wonderful guest co-host Nathan Douglas. Hello, Nathan.
Hello, gentlemen. Canadians crowding in.
Yeah.
How do you like it?
Well, 2 years ago, Nathan and I went to the Catholic Imagination Conference in 2022, and then after that, he visited me here in New York for a couple of weeks, and we were able to record episodes on the Flowers of St. Francis and Francesco together, and now he's back because we went to another Catholic Imagination Conference, this time at Notre Dame, where we presented a panel on the Vatican film list along with Andrew Petiprin. That should go up on YouTube sometime by the end of the year, hopefully, and I'll share it on our channel when it does. Everything went very nicely. So very happy to have Nathan here in person, and it's very timely to have him in person for this film because it's a film that is very important to all of us. At long last, Terrence Malick's 2011 masterpiece, The Tree of Life. This is also timely because this is a film about a family with 3 boys. And James here just became, well, his 3rd son was just born a week ago when we're recording this.
The first time we watched Tree of Life in preparation for this podcast was right before Beckett was born. And then the second time we watched it was right after. So this was like already this film is like devastating for me to watch because so much of it is about, this father-son relationship. But it was sort of like it reached a particular pitch over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Looking forward to talking about it.
The Tree of Life is my favorite film, and it may well be the greatest film ever made. And when I say greatest, I always need to qualify that because people, don't always know what I mean when I say something is great. It doesn't necessarily mean it's, the most perfect film ever made. For instance, there are films that are perhaps more perfect in their mode than greater films, which are attempting to do more, and they do it successfully enough, that we can say they're greater films, for instance. This film, of course, part of it is it's a very spiritual film and even a Christian film in many ways. But it's also because it has like the most poetic force of any film that I've seen, I think. And it's dealing with, it's trying to do so much. It's dealing with issues on such a cosmic scope that I for me is justified in the title of the greatest film ever. Now, it's okay if it's not, but that's how I feel about it. And I'm really excited to be talking about this. This is, for me, like the climax. That we've got more Malick to discuss after this, but for me, this is like the climax of our Malick series that we've been doing. And I don't know what else to say by way of introduction. Well, I guess it's about so much. It's been described as a very Augustinian film, but it's also been described as a very Job-like film. The film begins with a quote from the book of Job. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations, while the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" So it begins with this quote from the book of Job, and then it begins with an opening monologue after that about the way of nature and the way of grace, which we can talk about more. And it goes into this sort of, the way I see it is the movie has kind of like a Job section, and then it sort of transitions into a more Augustine's Confessions-like section where there's a lot of voiceovers asking the kind of questions directed to God in prayer that Augustine asks in the Confessions, starting out with not only, what things about the meaning of suffering, following the Job track, but also like things, finding the traces of God and the voice of God in your past and in your childhood, basically.
Yeah, it's funny because if you try to give a plot synopsis of this film, it's actually kind of unremarkable. Because what's the plot? Basically, there is the death of a brother, an adult brother, that prompts a kind of nostalgic recollection from the other brother and a kind of conversion, perhaps. But, narratively speaking, that's about what happens. And actually, it makes me think of a lot of Shakespeare's plots that, in a similar way, are kind of like on the face, not super remarkable, maybe a little, like, I don't know what to use the word, like standard or something. But it's what is explored within the container of that plot that is significant here. And so, that synopsis that you just gave, that sort of more like thematic one perhaps, is maybe a more accurate description of what the movie's about. And yet, at its core, it's still following this narrative, which is, brother or son dies, parents and other brother reflect, and a kind of enlightenment or conversion happens, perhaps.
Yes. And the key thing about this Augustinian reference really is memory. The theme of memory in the film, and that everything is filtered through memory. There are present day sequences in the film, but the vast majority of the film, as far as the characters are concerned, takes place in their 1950s childhood in a small town in Texas. And we should mention, I guess, that the parents are played by Brad Pitt and Jessica Chastain, and the adult, the main brother whose eyes we see through, Jack, right, is played as an adult by Sean Penn. So we're seeing a lot of things through his memories, also through his mother's eyes, and a little bit through the father's eyes. The other big thing to say is that this film has a long sequence near the beginning where we leave the characters behind altogether, except insofar as we are hearing some voiceover from them asking existential questions of God, because we see a long cosmic sequence involving basically the creation of the universe, from stars and cosmic gases to cells and amoebas and embryos to magma flowing and dinosaurs, and so that the film sort of goes into this other place for a while early on. For how long is that sequence, Nathan? Do you know?
I think it's only around 15 minutes, no more than 20 minutes.
Right, but it has this big presence in the film, and it just sort of just happens of a sudden. And then after that, we go back to the real extended memory sequence of tracing, the birth of the first child onwards up to, the ante rooms of tragedy.
Another thing that's significant
phrase,
about that sort of cosmologic sequence is that I don't know how this works out chronologically in terms of his body of work, but Malick, I think around the same time, is working on Voyage of Time, right? So that's a film of his that I keep forgetting about because it's sort of this like odd outlier. But Voyage of Time is kind of a kind of documentary on the cosmos, and features a lot of these similar kinds of images in terms of evolution, and like this like cosmic scope. So I don't know if we'll talk about.
We'll have to figure out where to fit that in. Yeah,
but it's clearly something that's on his mind, and Voyage of Time 2 features these kind of existential ruminating voiceovers as you're being presented with these cosmic images.
Right.
But its inclusion here is interesting too, because it takes something that is so personal, so bound up in the particulars of this family and its history and its dynamics and relationships, and then kind of explodes them outwards to be of this cosmic scope. Yeah. And vice versa. There's this cosmic drama that gets illustrated that then somehow reflects or contrasts what's happening on this personal level. Yeah. And so I think it's totally appropriate that the the film open with this Job reference, because it sets this hermeneutic, which is like, you know, Job, the whole story of Job is kind of this simultaneously deeply personal interior drama about a single man, but it also has something to say about the very nature of things and of this universe and of all of creation. And Tree of Life seems to have similar ambitions.
Yes, and something I wanted to mention too in that respect is that this film draws very much on Malick's own childhood growing up in Texas, and even details of his family losing a brother, and you know, some kind of maybe some kind of fraught relationship between the father and the brother. I mean, we don't have a lot of details on that, but it's a cosmic view, a very universalized view. It has the benefits of observation and like really true to life details of childhood from someone who has really journeyed in his own memory and brought that to life on film. But it also has the universality of something that it's a cosmic rather than like a narcissistic, you know, self-examination, if that makes sense. So it's really well observed. It's got so many beautiful concrete details. The three boys who play the kids are amazing. But yeah, like you said, it's very universal, and it's interesting. There is an extended version of this film. It's not the definitive version for Malick is the original theatrical cut, but he made this just because he had this other footage and decided to put out a different version of the film. And that one is a little bit more specific to these characters. It goes into a little bit more plot rather than sort of just sort of slice of life, I guess you could say. And it comes off as a little less universal and a little less just all filtered through memory, because it feels more in parts like a standard plot, if that makes sense. I don't know if you agree, James, but I think I like the theatrical cut better because it does feel more universal, and it feels more tight to the core of what this movie is, you know, and what makes it unique.
Yeah, the extended cut, you know, offers kind of a lot more context about the family, about the relations. We find out about, you know, the father, Brad Pitt's playing the father. We find out about his brother as a character who's completely missing from the theatrical cut. And then the other big major plot point that I recall is the main character, Jack, the oldest boy, gets sent to boarding school. So it's much more, it struck me as much more of a novelistic kind of coming of age story.
Right.
And it is interesting how, like you're saying, it has a way of, compared to the more impressionistic theatrical cut, the longer cut, because it is very focused in on this coming of age element, it feels kind of less universal. It definitely feels like a smaller kind of film in some ways, you know, because it's really narrowing in on this character.
Yeah, I think that the theatrical cut should be the first way that people experience this film. And I have no issue like treating it as the definitive cut. But I will say that after, like when we watched the extended, then we went back and watched the theatrical. And before I had a chance to go back to either one, here we are discussing it. I do want to go back and watch the extended cut again, because although my first initial response was, no, yeah, I like the theatrical cut better. It's tighter, it's cleaner, and it's the impression is stronger, in part because of its more fragmented and kind of ambiguous character. But I did find myself afterwards somehow like yearning for the specificity and the kind of depth that is allowed in the extended cut. And I think it's also this experience of time, because it's such an epic film with such grand, lofty aspirations. And to the theatrical cut's credit, it's not over long. You know, I mean, it's very tight, and he does a lot with what is really a very manageable runtime. But I think that the extended cut, rather than feeling like the addition of superfluous material, actually is quite nice in allowing you to kind of really kind of settle in to this reminiscence, really settle into this memory of this time without losing any of the other things that bookend the film. In fact, we get more time too with Sean Penn, with the adult brother, and sort of seeing what's going on with his life. He's mysterious in both cuts, but a little more fleshed out in the extended. So I think they're definitely both watching, and I would like to go back and check out the extended and really decide if it's my preference or not.
Yeah. So we've given a little bit of an idea of what the film's about, and there's a lot more thematically we could talk about. We haven't really discussed the nature and grace thing yet, for instance. There's just so much. I mean, we're not going to be able to get to it all. We've got about 2 hours, to do what we can. But I wanted to talk a bit about just what it's like to watch the film, like the experience of watching the film. We already talked about this cosmic sequence, but maybe following up on our previous discussions and how we've been tracking Malick's style, especially with The New World, where we felt that he was sort of coming into his what could be described as his mature style. It's the most like all of the films that came afterwards in terms of editing, for instance. And it's his first collaboration with Emmanuel Lubezki, his cinematographer. You mentioned fragmented memories, and so that's a lot of how this film works. Is it is flashing from one thing to another. In the early sequences where we're seeing Sean Penn, the adult Jack, we're seeing him in these kind of sterile, modern city office environments in Houston, and the memories are like these flashes breaking in. These very short flashes. It's not like a story. It's just an image from his childhood. And it's not just that they're these short snippets, but it's even like what we see and the angle from which we see it is like very, sometimes kind of like incidental. I want to say that there's a flash early on of him seeing, a bunch of the boys like running and jumping into a river or something like that. And I don't remember exactly, but there's just something about the angle of it that it's like, it feels like it wasn't neatly framed. It's just this snippet in time, and this thing you just happen to remember that specific thing that you saw at that moment, and that's how a lot of it works. And then later on, you get more of a step-by-step continuity, starting with childhood after the cosmic sequence, and but it's still got this very montage. It's like a really long montage, essentially the rest of the film, basically, which, I mean, frankly, is kind of how memory operates. Right.
Like our life to us before this moment is like a very long montage of whatever we happen to remember. And another thing that I'll say that's kind of remarkable about the cinematography is, we've commented on, especially in The New World, this sort of like free flowing character of the camera. Well, here, in these memories, it lends the camera a kind of perspective, almost as though it were first person. The camera is an observer, but it's also it's not a cold observer. It's not an objective observer. It's like there's one shot where I think it might be the mother. She's swinging, and the camera is following her up and down with the movement of the swing. Or there's a lot of these fluid gestures of the camera, and incidental sort of points of focus that give it this sense of being, almost like it were a first-person perspective. Of course, it's the perspective of the characters that we're following, and so it isn't literally first person, but it gives that impression. And it sort of all contributes to this very, very nostalgic feeling of the film.
It's striking just how close the camera gets to everything, and also compared to, we were talking in The New World about the Steadicam, and that film has a mixture of handheld and Steadicam photography, but here it's almost like the Steadicam. I'm sure there is Steadicam in this film, but I can't remember it. It's what's most kind of striking about the cinematography in Tree of Life is that they really Lubezki and Malick doubled down on handheld is the most intimate. We're going to get right in there. It gives them the most, because obviously the apparatus of the Steadicam is, is clunky, right? And it lets you do a lot and have a lot of flexibility, but you still can't maybe get as close as somebody who's as skilled an operator as Lubezki. He's probably the best. I'd say not probably. I will say hands down. He's got to be the best handheld camera operator in the world. Which means, what does that mean? Instinct, ability to anticipate action, knowing where to frame when. He just has incredible instincts, and that's how you get the New World. But that's how you get Tree of Life. All the film collaborations that he and Malick have done, what sets them apart is that anticipation, that ability to capture lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
Which is, partly his reflexes are a part of that, his artistic sensibility. But yeah, I think that's worth pointing out, because it really is, to sort of maybe first glance, it might seem like it's kind of rougher in some ways, because it's a lot more shaky and chaotic in how it's framed. But that's the effort of getting intimate. They're trying to get as close to the reality of what's happening, and it's quite powerful to see that.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, we've touched on the editing, we've touched on the camera work, and I think that this film is such a good film for people to watch if they're trying to get hip to these choices that are made in film. Because in a lot of movies, those things, the editing and the camera work, are the craft comes into like making them invisible, like specifically trying to get it so that you're not really thinking about these choices or noticing them. But here, it's very difficult not to notice what's going on. And so I think that this is a great film, sort of as because it's so starkly different stylistically from what viewers might be familiar with. It's great to like begin building an eye or that muscle for noticing these kinds of choices.
Yeah. So I don't remember if in the New World I mentioned this term, the dogma. So this is the kind of system of this sort of covenant developed between Malick and Lubezki, beginning with the New World and on Tree of Life as well, for how they were going to work together. And the key terms that they use, there's a great video essay on this on the Tree of Life Criterion disc. The key terms they use are naturalism and cubism. And the dogma also includes a lot of technical rules, which I won't mention, but some important points. One of them is wait for what happens and then follow it, as you were alluding to, James. So one example of that is the scene where you see the mother, played by Jessica Chastain, lying on the grass with a cat or with a butterfly, sort of caressing this butterfly on the grass, and this cat sort of stalking around from behind. And that's a great example of something that just happened, and they captured it. And they, even in the small sequence where there's some CGI dinosaurs, at the end of the cosmic sequence, they wanted to frame that even in a way to seem like they had just been stumbled upon, where the framing is like a little off kilter, for instance, in one of the shots. Another big thing is natural and real lighting to allow improvisation. And part of allowing improvisation is to create a world in advance. So in the house, they filled the drawers with stuff so that anybody could, on the spur of the moment, open the drawer and interact with things that weren't planned could happen. So they built everything, even things that they don't know if it would ever be needed or used. And Lubezki compares this to being like a jazz musician. So if the natural light in one room doesn't work, then you just switch to being in a different part of the house. And that's another reason why the handheld is so important, because the camera just needs to be able to follow the actors. And the other thing is that the cubist term refers to another thing you were alluding to, James, that basically means they're not worrying about the normal rules of continuity with editing, whether that be, where somebody was standing in a certain point, or it could be blocking, but it could be set dressing, but it could also be simply cutting from one camera angle. So we started talking about the jump cuts, I think, in the New World. So there's a lot of this where a really powerful example of this is the very beginning of the movie. The mother gets the news that her son has died, and she gets this letter, and it's such an incredible scene. And it's one of the scenes. This movie is just like throws so many images at you that I'm still like noticing things. But that's one of the scenes that I kind of like. I know the beats of it now, and So she's getting the letter. We just see her reading it, sort of not really responding. Then we see her kind of, throw it away and crumple it. And we get this like jump cut to just like a moment later in her processing her grief. And it's just a slight shift in the camera angle. It's like not that she's done anything or anything, but it just signifies like the passage of time or something like that. And then like we see her basically like fall to her knees and cry out. And then it like cuts away so quickly from that. And it's just like, it's awesome. It's so devastating. But it's the editing and the pacing of like the jump cuts and the unconventional way that they edit has so much to do with that. It's like I said in the last Malick episode, it's not necessarily like we're going to cut to a whole different perspective or a different thing that she's doing. It's just like these micro jumps that they can do this film can do huge jumps, and it also can do micro jumps, which just inject this little charge to the rhythm. And that's another thing I wanted to bring up is like the way it feels like kinetically to watch this film. This is like an incredibly just like kinetic film, there's a lot of action in a way. There's a lot of physical excitement with the boys running around and playing. And it's really of course there's the very still moments like in the cosmic sequence, but it's really an exhilarating experience watching the film, and the music contributes to that so much. So many amazing pieces of classical music that he uses. But the cutting and the way the camera moves throughout these just incredible childhood sequences, sort of accelerating from infancy to like the rapidity and like madness of like childhood where the kids are running around and getting into trouble. It's just like, it's so incredible and joyous. And that's like so much of the beauty of this film for me, especially on my first viewing, is just, it's those sequences that just life is just so, it's like more than any other film I've seen. And this gets to like what I said about its poetic power. This film just conveys like the throbbing of life more than any other film I've ever seen. Insofar as it is devastating in some ways, it's as much because of the beauty of what it shows as because of anything sad that happens with the characters. So it's just it just conveys the beauty of life and the beauty of childhood like nothing that you've ever seen, basically.
And part of that, it's interesting just hearing you say that made me think about how when everyone remembers the really rambunctious stuff from the film, throwing footballs over the house and stuff like that. All the playing scenes, the music, the Smetana piece, that everyone gets stuck in everyone's head afterwards. Anyway,
yeah.
But what's leaping out to me is, part of what makes it work, as you're saying, Thomas, is that there are so many scenes that are just recognizably from normal family life, especially. Your dad gets mad at you for not weeding properly or something like that. All these kind of mundane or just things that would get passed over in a more conventional story, but they're all mixed in. You feel like you're getting this quilt or these images of this entire childhood. Both the really pleasant ones, the fun ones, and the ones that are not necessarily bad. Some of them are obviously like very unpleasant and bad memories, but then there's just the ones in between that are kind of like, yeah, like I broke that thing, and I got in trouble, but it's no big deal.
Yeah, and it's a very sensual film. A lot of these images are very vivid and kind of rooted in this sensuality. You talked about, Nathan, the camera getting so close to its subject at times, or there being this exhilaration, but also, whether it's like the magma slowly oozing, or, water from a garden hose, over a bare foot or something. There's just a lot of things that give it this very tactile quality. A frog strapped to a rocket, that sort of like, it all goes hand in hand with this like very strong impressionistic quality of the film.
If you guys want to just get into the meat of the themes and the Christian stuff, and we can do that.
Where to begin?
Yeah, well, we can start with the opening monologue and go from there.
Oh no,
no, why not?
Because that just sounds so like, let's just start from the beginning and just work our way through.
Well, we don't have to do it, and I just mean start with the monologue. We don't have to then go chronologically.
Yeah. So what about the monologue?
Well, we should just bring it up as one of this framing things. That the first framing thing is the quote from Job, which I already read, and the second monologue has to do with nature and grace, and it's the mother's voice. The nuns taught us there are two ways through life: the way of nature and the way of grace. You have to choose which one you'll follow. Grace doesn't try to please itself, accepts being slighted, forgotten, disliked, accepts insults and injuries. Nature only wants to please itself, get others to please it too, likes to lord it over them, to have its own way. It finds reasons to be unhappy when all the world is shining around it and love is smiling through all things. They taught us that no one who ever loves the way of grace ever comes to a bad end. And then she says, I will be true to you, whatever comes. Now, a couple of bloggers online have noticed a similarity, not only between St. Paul's description of love, but also between a passage in the Imitation of Christ, which I would be surprised, frankly, if Malick had not read, because he's just a very well-read man. And I won't read the whole thing, but nature indeed is wily and betrays many through its deceits and crafty ways, and has always self as its end. Nature always looks to its own advantage, considering what gain it can derive from another, but grace is not concerned with its own profit, but with what may benefit others. There's some more along the same lines. And then the last line that this blogger quoted is, grace seeks comfort only in God, finding delight in the sovereign good beyond all things visible. So the two passages are very similar. I would say the only contrast I really noticed is where Malick says, love is smiling through all things, all the world is shining around it. Thomas à Kempis says, finding delight in the sovereign good beyond all things visible, which maybe is something we can come to back if that's a real contrast in the visions or not. But the other thing to say about this opening monologue is the nature and grace is from the mother's perspective, and so we are primed to think of the mother as like the representative of grace in the story. And the way that we are introduced to the father is kind of when she starts talking about nature. It's not like we just get a full-on close-up of his face or something, but he just sort of enters the picture around that point. And so I think, to me, it's fair to say that the mother tends to represent grace in the story. The father tends to represent nature. There's a line somewhere in the film, in the voiceover, mother, father, always you wrestle inside me, always you will. So that's a lot of what the child, Jack, is struggling with. One other thing I wanted to mention about this, there's a great essay by, I think, a Protestant writer named Brett McCracken about this film online. And he notes in Malick's whole career, a movement from cold anti-heroes in the first two films to angelic ethereal idealists. So a very similar pairing to the mother and father in this film is Jim Caviezel and Sean Penn in The Thin Red Line. And then to flawed, normal protagonists in search of the transcendent. And this film has a bit of both. I would say, Jack, the adult Jack, is very much the type of character that we see in the next few films, right? The three films after The Tree of Life, whereas the mother represents that kind of like ethereal, Jim Caviezel-esque or Pocahontas-esque, perspective. So those two sort of parts, those two types of characters that he's exploring are coming together.
This opening monologue is a good thing to bring up because as much as the quote about Job kind of sets up certain thematic ambitions that the film, aspires to, this opening monologue also is kind of a framing device for the entire film.
Right.
And one of the lines from that monologue that I would like to sort of stress is this line about love shining through all things.
Yeah.
Because it's echoed a couple of times. There's a line actually that Brad Pitt's character has where he's kind of it's this moment of remorse. He gets a few of these, this moment of regret, and he says something like, I was blind to the glory all around me or something. And I think that something like that is said a couple of times
yes.
Elsewhere in the film. But perhaps even more significantly, I would point to this visual motif that recurs that to me is kind of evocative of this line. There's this very mysterious image of kind of like waves of light sort of playing in the void.
Yeah.
That comes up at certain key transitions.
Right.
And he's usually, though not always, attended by a voiceover. Not sure exactly what it is, but maybe it's like, to me, it's evocative of like, in the beginning was darkness,
Right,
and like
right.
let there be light. There's this kind of like origin quality to it, but that image of the waves is actually rhymed throughout the film by different things, whether it's a flock of birds or the grooves in a canyon wall or the way light plays through water or the way, amoeba swim through like the cell's wall or something. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
And once you start sort of paying attention to it, it's really, you get this strong impression of, the creator's thumbprint or something.
Yeah.
That everything is suffused with this common substance.
Yes.
And such that, during this like cosmic creation sequence, you're sometimes not sure if you're actually viewing things on the microscopic or the macroscopic level.
Yeah. Right.
They look so much alike, what's happening in the cell and what's happening in outer space. And there's even this very striking moment where the mother herself is sort of caught up in this wave-like gesticulation suspended in the sky. Clearly this didn't happen in reality, but it's this strong, image of this like angelic being, like you were describing her. But it also rhymes with this visual motif of, what I take to be grace, love, shining through everything.
Yeah, I've always seen that as like I know it's not literally a flame, but it's always resembled a flame to me.
Sure.
Like a flame in the darkness. And I suppose in some level I connect that to Tolkien's the flame imperishable, which is like what God sends into the heart of creation to like make it real. And Tolkien says that it's also that Gandalf says he's a servant of the secret fire. Tolkien says that's the Holy Spirit. So that's like this creative, inner life of things.
It is the fire, but it's even the animals that we see, like the jellyfish that are floating through that have the exact same waves going on. We see these weird sea creatures that kind of move in a similar way.
Yeah.
Same with the plants, as they're swaying through the water, or the sand that's being blown across the dunes. It's this rhyming visual motif.
Yeah, that's great. I never thought about that.
Yeah. Oh, and so the reason I think that's significant is because, right, it's not that it's not like nature in a reductive way, right? It's not nature as in like the world, that's Devil Sea or something, It's like nature in like a more profound way, because the natural world is actually where you make contact with this way of grace, and actually by contrast, it's the artificial world that's so cold and that the men are kind of caught up in this film, the father and the older brother. Whenever we see Brad Pitt's character off at work, he's in these very industrial spaces with hard angles and, sort of like very stark colors and loud noises. And same with Sean Penn's character. The spaces that he's moving through are very cold, very angular, very sterile. So if anything, the natural world is the one that's more infused with this grace than the artificial world that man so often inhabits.
Right.
Another thing I'll say too about this opening monologue is just that while the father, Brad Pitt's character, is kind of set up as the sort of representative of the way of nature, during this opening monologue, we get these glimpses of the mother's own childhood, where she's with her father. And actually, the impression that you get is that this father is passing on this wonder to her. And so right from the beginning, we get this sort of nod of acknowledgement that it's not just like that fathers are doomed forever to be these corrupting influences, and mothers are the ones who lead to God. Because clearly with Jessica Chastain's character, it was her relationship with her own father that was able to unlock this for her. And it just so happens that, she's going to be that for her children. And so we can maybe, be a little more sympathetic with Brad Pitt's character. He's not always cast in a kind of villainous light. We get a lot of nice
we get more about
him.
His father in the extended edition.
Yes,
making him a little more sympathetic.
That's right. But even in the theatrical cut, we get some nice moments with him playing with his children, or spraying them with the hose, and clearly genuinely wanting to love his children, but being so thwarted too by a lot of imperfection.
I think what comes across to me in terms of we're getting the child's perspective on him most of the time is the kind of like almost the capricious nature of him. Like one moment he's playing with them, one moment he's yelling at them. Even when he's playing with them, he's often got this kind of like very dominant kind of hand on the back of the neck thing going on.
If I can just say as a quick aside, Brad Pitt's physical performance in this is so good.
Let's just talk about how great Brad Pitt is in this.
Well,
it's amazing.
All the performances are wonderful. You already mentioned the children, but I did want to point out this particular aspect of his performance, the physical performance. You watch the way this man walks, the way he hugs, the way he touches, the way he eats. As he's sat at the table, sort of guarding his food almost, like there's so much physically that is so suggestive about how this man moves through space, and you can feel it. I actually was watching the credits closely afterwards, because I saw that he has a hand double, and I wonder if it was just because of the sequences that we get where he's playing the organ.
Oh, probably,
it might just be that, because otherwise, there's so many shots of his hand and the contact that his hand makes, whether it's with a ruffle of the hair or something placed on the back of the neck or on a shoulder. And every one of these is charged with a kind of significance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I rewatched Seven recently, which was one of Brad Pitt's like breakout films, right? And one thing that leaped out to me in that film, which is mid '90s, this is young Brad Pitt, is how energetic he is and how just like explosive he is. And when I saw the film, I was kind of I was like, man, I kind of miss this Brad Pitt, because I feel like everything he's done pretty much from the era that The Tree of Life was being shot. It started really with Assassination of Jesse James, which came out in 2007. But this kind of mid 2000s Brad Pitt is when he became a much more quote unquote like, he was always a serious actor, like he was always a very committed actor, but that's when he started to move away from his like ladies man, romantic comedy, action star kind of persona. And so with that, you see this internalization going on where the performances start to get they start to get very kind of internalized compared to the very charismatic, outgoing, kind of expressive Brad Pitt that we were used to. Assassination of Jesse James is kind of the launch of this, and that film is very, very like influenced by Malick in general.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Just certainly in style. It's very much got a Days of Heaven kind of influence going on. But that there you see, in that film, Brad Pitt is playing Jesse James with this deeply controlled. Like you see, the thing is like it's similar to performances by someone like Daniel Day-Lewis, where you see the craft on screen. We could have a long debate. I don't know if we'll get into it about like the merits of that. Actors all have their tools and tricks and everything and so on. But it's interesting to see an actor like Brad Pitt, again, who's very outgoing in his performances, gets very internal. And he brings that experience, I think, from his experience on Jesse James into The Tree of Life, which is one of the next films that he shot. And it's interesting because I think you see the perfection in a way of what makes him a compelling physical performer, in ways even that I would say I don't think he's ever kind of reached this stage again. I think in some ways he actually, after The Tree of Life, in his roles going forward, he kind of learned, I think he learned the benefit of being a much more controlled, maybe like a less kind of reactive performer, to the point that his performances from the last decade, to me at least, feel overly mannered. They feel overly controlled. I don't feel like he's really tapping into the kind of like that energy or that intuition. So for me, like his performance in The Tree of Life is this kind of like perfect peak in a way of him finding this balance between the reactive and the charismatic and the instinctive and the very controlled and formalized. And it's a perfect role for that because he's playing this very formalized masculine mid-century type,
it's also a very improvisational movie, so maybe it helps to keep that balance where you're not just totally controlled and mannered as well.
Totally. However, it seemed to have produced this real thing in the middle, this real performance in the middle that's kind of gathering the goods, at least from what I can see.
Yeah.
Someone else worth mentioning, I think, is Sean Penn, because so little is seen of him, and yet his presence looms very large in the film. And I think that, there's a couple things going on there. One, this child actor who plays the Sean Penn character as a child, so good. He's like really good.
Yeah.
And he looks like he could pass as a boy Sean Penn, there is this kind of strange similarity that I can't quite put my finger on, but I buy it.
Yeah.
But also I think that Sean Penn, I don't know if it's importing something that we know about this actor, and his personality, based on other roles that we've seen him in, or if it's just kind of something about his look and how he kind of effortlessly conveys this kind of malaise. But it's enough. And I don't know if he was annoyed at not being featured more prominently throughout the film, but I think it's still deserving of top billing, which it has. It's like The Tree of Life, Brad Pitt, Jessica Chastain, Sean Penn, because what he's bringing to the table still is effective and operant throughout, right up until this really climactic sequence at the end that kind of defies description.
What do we think of these Sean Penn sequences? And I don't mean the final sequence, but like more of the present day realistic ones, or the ones where he's just wandering in the desert, surrealistically. Are these, do they feel integrated with the rest of the film to you? Do they feel like they're as interesting as the rest of the film to you? I'm just curious how you guys respond to those, how these lodge themselves in your imagination, or not. I mean, it sounds like to you, James, that you said that you feel their presence in the rest of the film. What do you think, Nathan? Are these?
Yeah, no, I think they're critical. Just on a purely visual note, I'm obsessed with how the Terrence Malick shoot like the skyscrapers and the concrete, the lines of modernity that you see I think it's Houston that they're shooting in, and the way that it's the first time we've seen Malick shoot a city, shoot a contemporary city, I should say. Something that really, he didn't build himself in a way or really kind of pull out of his imagination. And I don't know, it's just such a compelling kind of image of what modern life looks like.
Right.
But in general, yeah, I think it's a very important, context for the whole film. Like I think it would be losing something very important to not.
Right. Yeah. The feel of those scenes, I mean, is very much continued in To the Wonder and Night of Cups.
Especially Night of Cups. It feels like a test run of
both with like the type of character and the cold kind of disconnected feeling of it.
Kind of like wandering through this alien landscape, not really knowing where you are.
Right. He's in his own office building, but he kind of looks like he doesn't know where he is.
Totally.
Totally.
Yeah. And it's not just these sequences visually, but also what's going on in the voiceover that's really critical. So we get a lot of just kind of like really important lines from Sean Penn in the voiceover that kind of situate us as we go back into this history. So early on, one of the things that he says is mother, brother, it was they who brought me to you, or something like that. So already it's like we're beginning at the end. We already have this suggestion of his conversion, of his finally finding whoever it is that he's addressing in this prayer. And so we have that orientation, he's going to arrive. And now we're inside of the bewilderment before arrival, and then at other points throughout the film, we get, other sort of voiceover lines that kind of harken to this journey and this searching. I think there's one line that says, like how did you come to me, or something like that, and then it's so much of the purpose of these,
like, when did I first hear your voice, that kind of thing.
these reminiscences, these reveries, is to try to find the action of grace, and where was a way lost and where was someone found. And to me, this is what makes the whole memory exploration interesting at all,
right?
Because otherwise this would just be another story like Days of Heaven or Badlands,
right,
out in Texas. That I'm also searching, I'm sort of like hastily rummaging around in the drawers of memory with Sean Penn, just trying to find like the key.
Right.
And
so even though the visuals are of these office buildings and stuff are kind of like alienating, they're not as like enticing perhaps as like the childhood sequences and the nature, they still, like, without that theme of memory, like, a lot of the meaning of that stuff in their childhood is not conveyed in the film. You have to have the framing.
Yeah. And there was one more thing I wanted to say. It keeps leaving me. It's because this darn movie is so rich, and there's so much that one could latch on to. But just give me a second, or else it's gonna. No, because as soon as you say something else, it's this theme of searching for God that I think is one of the most spectacular accomplishments of the film, because how do you depict visually or in storytelling form the blindness that comes about from sin and fallen nature? Because like, it's blindness, and it's so hard to sort of recognize it in yourself, let alone like describe it to another. And yet I think that what we have here is kind of this amazing exploration of this dynamic, which is that God is simultaneously like closer to us than we are to ourselves, and totally ineffable and hidden, and we are completely at his mercy,
right?
To be found, and have our eyes opened. And so this is like the big meditation for me every time I'm watching this film is the same questions that this Sean Penn character is bringing to bear are the same questions that I have in my life, and that I want answered in my life, and that can only be answered by God.
Yeah.
It's great. Interesting, how many people, we've heard over the years who've expressed their love for this film, and the universal kind of quality of it, and even my own experience of it. I forget how many times I've seen the film, but every time I come to it, it's the feeling of the film is reading me. I'm not reading the film is reading me. At whatever point of my life that I'm in, my reaction to the film changes. And obviously every film is like that to some extent if you're rewatching, but this one in particular, there's something about it, even compared to other Malick films, before and after, but particularly before, where those films are kind of, closed in a way. They're closed and focused on their subject matter, on their characters, on their stories. And they're in a very expansive way, but still, this is at another level. This really is something that is very particular, and it reaches that point of speaking to the universal, to the point where every viewing is a new experience. And I think it's very unusual, even among not very unusual among Malick's filmography, because I think he's kind of tending towards that for his whole career. But it still is. That's probably what makes it really stand out. One thought I just wanted to maybe a formal thought to kind of like try to flesh that out a bit is, it really struck me on this viewing how, we've been talking in previous episodes about Malick as a realist. He's kind of, and he's poetic, and he's realistic, and he's merging this kind of like, poetic realism. I don't know if it's the right term, but in the films up until this point, what I see at least is him trying to navigate his relationship to reality through the image, through photography. And what's so interesting about the Tree of Life in this regard is, after the New World, which was this kind of height of historical realism and really getting you into this sense of we are here in this historical setting. And now here we are in this kind of, contemporary historical mix. But he kind of does a left field move where all of a sudden he's mixing very realistic, the material with the children is the height of like kind of this poetic realism that he's been refining his whole career. It's absolutely sublime. And then at the same time, he's mixing in these extremely allegorical images. The sequence where Jack is born, is this chain of purely symbolic imagery, has absolutely no basis in photographic reality, and it just really leaped out at me this time, because I'm like, this is so it's entirely he's playing with not just it's this play with symbols and in our pre-existing concepts of what is photographic reality, and all of that, what that all means to me. What I see in it is it's a truly Catholic, a truly universal embrace of the entirety of like the imaginative, the relationship of the imagination to reality through the film medium, which is, in terms of the poetic relationship, filmmakers are often wrestling with, I'm here to tell a story. Like they perceive themselves as functional creatures who are trying to achieve a certain function. So if you're typically, as a storyteller, I'm a storyteller. I'm not going to do anything that gets in the way of the story. And then someone who maybe departs from that and is, focusing in on an object in a very particular way to appreciate its beauty or whatever, that gets seen as, oh, that's inefficient or that's not necessary. So we might put them to the side and say, hey, they're more of a poetic filmmaker or more of a experimental filmmaker, someone who gets caught up in the nature of the medium and is really playing with the physicality of it. They're kind of avant-garde, experimental. Let's put them in these categories. And what I see here at every level, you see Malick is pulling from every single one of these categories, even from the avant-garde movements. There's moments in this that are literally quoting the work of Stan Brakhage, who's like one of the most major American avant-garde filmmakers. The scene in question is the Jessica Chastain and Brad Pitt after they have gotten married. We see them in this brief scene with a light that's kind of rotating through a room. That's lifted directly from the Stan Brakhage short about a married couple, and it's particularly the thing is the light. It's a shifting light. So Malick, cool. I think that might be the only time Malick is absolutely 100% literally quoting another filmmaker to that extent. But even then, there's the framework. The way that he plays with frame rates in some of the earlier parts of the film. He's bringing that whole range of like the whatever you might call the poetic narrative tradition of American cinema, which is classic Hollywood and New Hollywood, which he's part of, and he's also bringing this avant-garde tradition. Like, it's all here. And not only that, he's not just kind of putting all his eggs into one basket where he's like, we're just going to go all in on realism. We're going to do like a neo-realist kids movie or something like that. It's like, no, he's doing it all, And to me, it's such a synthesis, and it's not doing it all in a buffet style, where a lot of filmmakers do this. You'll see them they'll pull their styles, and you see the work on screen. He's not doing that. It's coming from a synthesized place where he is truly, it's saying what he wants it to say, and it's saying it in his way. And I think that's partly why it's such a magnificent achievement. It exhibits a synthesis of this form and this intention, and this, that is very hard to achieve.
Yeah. And also a lot of those things there are a few things that are deliberately kind of surreal and strange feeling, but a lot of those things don't feel out of place because the way he shoots real life is so like magical, already, that it's like if she's like, oh, fine, she's floating for a minute, like that's cool. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't feel like this weird thing.
Right. Yeah. And yet there is still this embrace of the medium as a photographic one, as one that captures reality in this painstaking detail. There's this embrace of that throughout, but without there being a slavish sort of dependence upon it or need to serve it, you know?
Yeah.
So there is, like, you talked about this being one of the greatest films of all time. You know, it is, I think, also one of the most perfect. I think there's a real perfection in his use of all of these different methods or tools. There's a feeling that each one is like, yes, like this had to be this way. This was the perfect gesture here. This was yeah. Mwah.
Yeah, but it doesn't feel it. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you. But it also doesn't, because of Malick and the way his style works. There's also a feeling of freedom. It doesn't feel like this is the only way it could have been necessarily, but like this, it's just like this it's like these riches overflowing from the, you know, this wise scribe or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, it feels like there's more he could have given us, but this is what he gave us.
Bring new and old things out of your treasure.
And that's what his comment about the extended edition was. Nobody expects Bob Dylan to play a song the same way every night, so why do I have to like make only one version of the same movie? So that's a sense of that, like, maybe there doesn't have to be a definitive version, but in any case, you know, what it feels like is not a perfection in the, like, Kubrick kind of like beep, 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 you know, kind of thing. Kubrick noises, but you see what, you know, you get the contrast I'm saying. Like it feels like more of just like a free, generous overflowing, and not of like a preciousness. Even though he may take a long time in the edit.
Yes, and it's this freedom is key, you know, because he's free to select a tool at hand, you know, that he intuits or desires, you know, without this kind of, he's not beholden to any sort of extrinsic necessity, that this is his vision and his film.
Yeah. You can feel the life underneath. And so it's kind of like an organic sprouting forth of the life of this, the inner life of this film and of the methods that they chose to use, as opposed to like something that's sort of like pieced together from the outside, as it were. There's a spontaneity, and I don't mean just in the sense of improvisation, but in the sense of like the way that the form of the film assembles itself, even in the edit.
Yeah, totally. It's even funny how, you know, the creation sequence is achieved with these incredible physical special effects by Douglas Trumbull, you know, who famously did the special effects on 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Oh, well, okay. That's amazing.
And Trumbull, I believe, you know, was he? I think he came out of retirement to work on the film because he realized Malick was giving him the green light and the resources to kind of just completely play. So the vast majority of the cosmic creation sequence, like the space creation stuff, those are all these, you know, crazy fluid combinations that
like
they're
chemicals
doing.
Mixing together,
chemicals shot at different frame rates and shutter speeds and all that. And so I don't know. To me, that's probably what makes that so effective, even though I'm not saying like a CGI version of that wouldn't be worth watching, but it definitely, I think part of what makes it so memorable and it is, you know, the unpredictability of working with these very concrete materials. And it leaped out at me because the few moments that are all CGI or based on very CGI elements, they really stand out.
Yeah.
You know, when we're heading inside, and to Malick's credit, you know, it's the kind of things that you cannot depict through material objects, you know, going inside a cell, that kind of thing, you know, but it does stand out as like, you're like, okay, this is all CGI and I'm in a different space. This feels different. And I'm glad, I was really grateful on this viewing that they clearly limited that, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Dinosaurs.
Yeah, how about them dinosaurs?
I think some people would watch the dinosaur scene and be like, "Oh, this looks dated," but whenever,
it's okay
it's fine. Yeah. So when I see it, when I see any CGI, essentially, I process it as dated, even if it's brand new, because I like know that this will look dated in 10 years. So like, therefore, it doesn't bother me if something like is not up the cutting edge anymore, you know?
Yeah.
But I don't know, man. I just, like you said, Nathan, what people remember a lot is just the kinetic childhood sequences. And just, I think this film is so beautifully observed in that whole section, you know, beginning with the birth in a kind of a surreal or symbolic poetic mode, where we see like angels kind of like ushering a child down this path, and then suddenly, you know, like somebody's like plunging through the water, and then, you know, suddenly we're in the hospital and the baby's coming out. And but then from then on, like the observations of these like really minute stages of development in babyhood, and then we get the brother born and the reactions of the older brother to the baby, and the first stirrings of like jealousy, and like the first time he learns about the line between his yard and the neighbor's yard, and the first indications that their father thinks their mother is naive, and the sort of the first sensations of like this wrestling inside of the child between the mother and the child, between the mother and the father, all of these things, the first time that they see a crippled man and their reaction to that, the first time they see people getting arrested, and the questions that echoes when there's a boy in the community who drowns in the public pool. There's so many amazing, just so many amazing little moments that come together to create this complete picture of childhood. There's the Augustinian things people notice, like the breaking of the window of the shed. It feels very much like the pear tree in Augustine's Confessions, of just doing transgression just for transgression's sake. Core is this developing like encroachment of the father upon like this like childlike joy that he's receiving from life, from God, from his mother. And so you start to feel that tightness and that tension more and more. Like this father has just this presence who injects like tension and like danger whenever he enters the equation, to the point where, you know, when he leaves on a trip, it's like this huge like exhalation from everybody just running around the house. Of course, in the normal ways that it might happen, even if you have a good father, right? Your father leaves and then you kind of like go a little crazy. But like in this case, you really feel it, because it's like, it feels like even the mother is free to be herself now. So there's just so much.
Yeah. I think something that's also very well done in this moral development of the child as we see it is that, yes, we're seeing how the father is this kind of, corrupting influence. We get a line from the boy at a certain point where he says, I'm more like you than I am like her. Or something like that. But I think also the film is able to thread the needle of not letting this kid off the hook either. So you do get a sense of his culpability as well, that there's that both these things can be true. He's a victim of his father, but he also has something genuinely to repent of.
Yes.
Yes. And so this is part of the mystery of who we are, and of original sin and all of these things. There's this line that the father has where he says something like, if you're too good, the world will take advantage of you, or something like that, and it's like, well, what a terrible thing to tell your son, because now goodness is not actually desirable. It's actually a liability, and so this is a victimization, and this is there's a sense in which, for this child and for all of us, that our sin is a response to having been wronged ourselves, and yet we are wrong, and we get his guilt, we get his shame, and we get his pride, the same pride that exists in the father, saying, you can't be too good. The world will take advantage. Exactly, like don't ever say can't. Don't say you can't. I think of course there are different ways that you could take that, but I think that sort of like fundamentally, existentially, we all really are in a state of can't. This pride emerges in the son as well. And we see him wrestling with that and asking himself questions like, how do I get back to where they are? you know? And so yeah, it's all very, well observed, like you said. And
one of the things you feel most keenly, especially in the later sequences of Jack's childhood, is the way that sin like just cuts you off from everybody else. And that is the case in his developing jealousy and envy of his brother and his brother's talents. We see the beautiful scene where the brother and the father are playing a duet. The brother plays like classical guitar, the father's playing piano, and they're playing, and the father's just like looking at the brother with admiration at one point as he stops and just listens to the brother play. And the middle brother, unfortunately, whose name I don't remember, but he's the brother who we find out has died at the very beginning of the film later on. But you see Jack sort of circling the outside of the house and looking through the windows, and you can tell there's envy. There's another scene where he ruins like a watercolor painting that his brother is doing, and then you just see him bullying him in various ways, and the tragedy. And of course, these memories are very poignant because we know these are the memories of an adult man who's lost his brother, right? And like, but there's also these tender scenes, beautiful tender scenes of forgiveness and just affection between the brothers, as well as between Jack and his father, later in the film. And even in one very early in the film, we get an adult Jack on the phone with his father apologizing for something he said to them, and we get the impression that this is a relationship that they're still working at and still trying, which is great. But nowhere do you feel this disconnect more than in the scenes of his like first sexual sins, which is handled like just about as tastefully as you could, as like sort of obliquely. But basically you see him becoming aware of women, but what happens is he goes into a neighbor woman's house and like rifles through her drawers and steals a negligee. And then we see him like throwing it into the river out of shame later on. And then he comes home and he is like at a remove from his mother. And he says like, I can't talk to you. Like, don't look at me. And it's like, it's devastating, but it's so real. And that's something that I'm sure other filmmakers have portrayed shame, but shame is a big thing in this movie. That's one of the things the father confesses, is that he placed his shame on his son. And the way that the effect of sin and the feeling of having sin and the feeling of darkness and dirtiness and being cut off from everybody else is just very honestly observed without really reveling in like the sin itself. It's very well done. And Malick in his next few films is gonna like, you could argue there's reveling, happening there. So, because sexual sin and shame and those things are a big part of the next three films he makes thematically.
Yeah, something that I like about how long the film sort of dwells on this experience of shame and of guilt and of the consequence of sin is because this is actually, in retrospect, for someone who has found God, an experience of God, So there's a line, a voiceover line where we hear Sean Penn say, "Always you were calling me," and in my reading, this is the hound of heaven. This is sort of the how the Holy Spirit disquiets and upsets the conscience, when we're moving away from God. So to me, as devastating as this is, it's also fundamentally hopeful because it's this this calling back, and it's like the answer to how do I get back to where they are, and it's this it's not the direct answer, but it's a suggestion of it, which is the cross and reparation. And it's, for me, one of the things that makes this final ending sequence so beautiful is this this sense throughout that sequence, which maybe we can talk about now.
Yeah.
Of like all things being repaired, of there being this look backwards was not just fruitless. It wasn't just this sort of exercise in solipsism or something, but it's actually with a view toward this recapitulation and this reparation of all of these relationships, from most consequential to even most incidental. We get in this ending sequence the reappearance of these different characters who maybe even in the long memory sequence were just little blips on the radar, but still somehow are restored at the end, So I don't know. Yeah, should we talk about this?
Yeah, Nathan and I had like a long conversation about this sequence the other night because my experience of it and my understanding of what it's saying has sort of developed each time I've seen the film. And so the first time I saw this movie, this was like the part that I was unsatisfied with. I first of all read it as like, this is like heaven. That was my initial reading of it. And it somehow felt like a little too easy, like everybody's just together and happy on this salt flat or whatever, but it's kind of, it just felt a little too easy, sort of like the ending of Hidden Life, where Blessed Franz's wife is like, does this monologue about how now we're all gonna like go like plant trees or whatever, and I was just like, this feels a little too Episcopalian, just like a little too easy, Then the second time I saw it, like I was just more tuned into like everything being filtered through memory. So then the second time I saw it, I was like, oh, this is a healing of memory. This is like a reconciliation of all of the people in his life, in his memory, like, or in his desire. And then the third and fourth time I saw it, I noticed there are actually scenes of people literally rising from the dead. Like before we see everybody come together, like there's characters we don't even know, just kind of like there's corpses and then people getting out of like a deathbed and stuff. And I'm like, okay, so it is a resurrection sequence. But what happens right after that sequence is the mother gives up her dead son to God. She's like, I give you my son. There's this surrender. And so like there would be no need for that. If that was like us literally seeing the resurrection, then like there would be no need for her to give her son up after her. So my final reading of this is that this scene represents the hope of the resurrection. Like it doesn't represent like, we're not seeing it happening, but this represents the character's hope for that. Because it's the hope for resurrection that then allows her to fully surrender her son to God, which obviously like would be happening like after the resurrection and everybody being in heaven together. Right. So that's like that's the best way that I can read it. Like in terms of like the theology of it. I still find it somewhat unsatisfying. Like I'm satisfied with it on a conceptual level now, but like on the level of like visual symbolism, first of all, I find it very powerful when the family gets together, especially the mother and son. I like that. I always shed a tear at that part. But something about the imagery and even like the scenery feels a little bit unsatisfying. And I was talking to Nathan about this. I think it's because it feels kind of flat and like imminent. Maybe like the worldly person's imagination of like, oh, I'll go to heaven and I'll like be with all my loved ones again. But there's not that much about, of course, God is important in the movie, but I think what I feel is missing is that it's so unrooted from like Christian imagery. Like Malick's really good about God as like this distant thing. He's also, I think, good about like God the Father, and he's good about grace, like imminent and being shown through nature. But the incarnation is not really, when we talk about Malick's films as Christian films, like at least up to this point, the incarnation is not really there. Like Christianity, of course, is about Christ. It's about the God-man. We don't really have anything of that in the films except for a little bit. There is an image of Christ at one point in the middle of the film in their church, but it's something visually on the level of like iconography that I find unsatisfying about these characters all just kind of like wandering on this beautiful kind of flat land with the sun in the background. It is visually beautiful, but I'm about to make a comparison which like may seem like horribly insulting, and I don't mean it that way, but it kind of makes me think of like this artwork that like the Vatican uses for like the Synod or whatever, where it's like kind of, this is obviously at a much higher aesthetic level, but like it's kind of like reinventing the wheel in the sense that it's not like using any kind of like concrete Christian iconography. It's just like it's always like just a bunch of people with like stick figures with hands linked or something like that. So on the level of the characters, I find that scene deeply moving. But on the level of like the cosmic thing and like something that I'm looking for as a Christian, I don't find it totally satisfying on the level of imagery. And I'm not sure why, you know, it may be that he is pulling his punches because like he thinks this is what the audience is able to receive. Like he's not going to show like the heavenly court and like, you know, or whatever. He's not going to, you get the point. But there's something, there feels like on the level of image, something a little bit missing to me. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'll say that I think it's a mistake to think of this as an afterlife sequence. So I think that so long as you conceive of it as a depiction of heaven or of purgatory or of what happens after life, that it will be trite and it will be lacking. I don't think that this is a film that, you know, begins with the death of the brother, goes back into history, and then fast forwards to the end of life. We don't get any suggestion that Sean Penn has died and moved on.
Right.
So to me, my reading is that this is actually a dramatization, a depiction of this inbreaking of light, this moment of conversion, this turning back to God, this finding the path again. And that this is primarily an interior landscape, almost as if this were the space inside of contemplation, inside of prayer, and the kind of progress, the pilgrim's progress that takes place inside of a heart. Even though we get these moments between other characters, my reading is that this is all fundamentally from the perspective of Sean Penn. And that, for instance, that moment that you referred to of the mother being reunited with her son as a child, right? Not as an adult, but as a child, not as the adult who died, but as the child that Sean Penn remembers.
Right.
That this is an important an important thing for Sean Penn, for the older Jack to see and to accept this love that the mother has for his brother, that he has harbored this envy for, right? That's allowed to be inside of him, and that he can accept that. You know, we see this kind of beginning of a reconciliation or an understanding between he and his father. It's not there yet. It's not a relationship being perfectly restored, but it's I can see my father for who he was, a broken man like myself, and I can walk with him, maybe, you know? So I think that when you give it a kind of, I don't want to call it a psychological reading, because I do think that it's theologically rich. I think that on this you know, precipitating moment of the mother offering her son, this is not something that's happening, you know, in a chronological sequence, but it's a connective link. It's actually the whole thing that enables him to be saved. It's this, he depended upon this surrendering, this consecration that he received from his mother, that this is not something that he has done for himself. We have this line earlier on, "Mother, make me good," right? This is our prayer, all of us. And it's to the Blessed Mother. You know, I think that Jessica Chastain's character is, you know, a very Marian figure.
Yeah.
And so that it's the mother who makes him good by being this intercessor who's able to do for him what he can't do for himself.
Are you talking about Jack?
Yeah.
Okay.
Surrender him to God, and he you know is found. He was lost, and now he's found. You know,
I think that surrender is totally about his younger brother and his death. I don't think it's Jack. Because we see her like letting him, the younger brother, like loose at that same thing. She's like letting him go, like out into the distance. I think it's totally her surrender, like her grief process. I don't think it's about, I mean, not that the stuff you're saying is not something that her character is doing with her children generally, but I think that moment is totally about the younger brother.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that like there's that this can be like a both and thing, you know, that like I don't think that there's any reason to think that if she's going to surrender one son, that she's not ready to surrender them all, you know, that this is like
right,
like a hallmark of mothers who are good.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's really interesting hearing these viewpoints. So, like Thomas, my first several viewings of the film, I sort of just saw it as heaven, as this kind of disappointing vision of heaven. And what kind of strikes me more after that stage, you know, seeing it more as just a general kind of reconciliation. I do think the eschatological aspect is there because we see that image of like the earth being destroyed.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, so it's, you know, but I don't think it's saying like, oh, that's where, you know, he dies. It's just, we are leaping forward to like beyond time.
Yeah.
But what struck me just hearing you guys talk about it is the purgative aspect. You mentioned purgatory, James. I do think there's something to the idea that Malick, again, being very faithful to kind of like what can photography depict. Two thoughts on this. One, given his, you know, Protestant background, I don't know his views on Christian art, but the way that Christian iconography is largely missing from something like this, I think suggests that he, you know, holds to, you know, a more scripture centric or scripture only, I guess, kind of view of what medium can possibly contain, you know, what we want to say or depict about these things. Scripture is kind of the height of that. And, you know, he opens the film with the quotation from Job. And it's interesting that, you know, obviously Malick is an incredibly urbane, cultivated personality. If he wanted to use, you know, Christian art forms, you know, there's nothing stopping him from doing that. So I think it must be, you know, a very intentional choice and not just like an ignorant choice.
Right, yeah.
And I would hazard a guess that it's probably because the glory that he is, you know, that of the reality of that state is something that, you know, he doesn't think can be convincingly placed on film, which leads me to think of this whole section as a purification, you know, and that's really what it is. You know, it's interesting. We see the reconciliation of Brad Pitt's character. His great fault is resolved in the Texas 1950s timeline. You know, he reconciles with his son. He repents. Jack's great problem, we see that within the larger framework of his whole lifetime. He repents. Jessica Chastain's character, the mother, she does not receive the deliverance from her pain, from her grief, from what she needs to let go of until this after beyond time thing. So that leads me to think that it is a purification stage, and partly, actually, for me, the thing that disturbed me the most on this viewing was the idea of she is reconciled with the middle son, and then there's that image of her kind of seeing him off out the door into the desert, and he kind of wanders off by himself. And it's, you know, if this is the resurrection of, you know, what's going on, you know. But I think I think it's a purification, and he's ready to go to be fully participate in the beatific vision, and she's not quite there yet. She is,
and she doesn't see it. It's not that he's going into the desert, but she just doesn't see the place that he's going to.
Yeah, and also, the desert is kind of it's an appropriate setting for this because of the kind of purity of the sand. It's this very white, sandy. You know, it's very bare and abstract, but at the same time, there's a pure kind of quality to it. But you know, I think she has this. She's holding on to something. She's holding on. It's not just simply like the effects of sin or whatever, but even just like the attachment of like she's holding on to kind of maybe a worldly attachment. You know, that has to be purified. And so once she is able to freely give that, she's ready to also go on to the beatific vision, which we kind of, I think there's an implication of that. The way the light is kind of getting stronger and stronger in that scene. It's this very glowy kind of thing. So I would say I don't think Malick thinks he can depict heaven,
right?
Is my guess. And this is kind of an interim stage.
Yeah, James, I do agree with you that this works best if conceived as like an interior vision.
Yeah, and one of the things that for me lends this line about surrendering the son a kind of ambivalence is the visuals surrounding it. The other time where we get this like really bright light is the birth sequence.
And the presence of angelic figures as well as both of those sequences.
Right. So there's this giving birth. It sort of rhymes with this moment of bringing the child to life.
Right.
And so to me, this is a climax not just for the mother and her relationship with her dead son, but also and perhaps even primarily for Sean Penn himself.
And we continue to see this through his perspective.
Yes, and one of the reasons why I think that we're meant to see this through his perspective is because of all of these characters that he's encountering being the characters from his past, you know, that we've just sort of gone through. We even see like, you know, the little boy with like the like messed up hair, you know, the burn, you know, and both of his brothers, we see in their sort of remembered child.
Yeah, and he's there as an adult.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and it's like when I think back to my relationship with my siblings, I'm not really thinking of them as adults because those formative years, the most time that I spent with them were with them as children, you know, and so that's one of the things that makes sibling relationships difficult, you know, is being able to update that later on. But like, I think so I think that like, you know, again, like this is something that's true of Malick as a filmmaker is he gives a lot of breathing room for us to bring these interpretive, you know, these interpretive perspectives.
Yeah, because they're also like, instead of seeing it in a totally like chronological sense or whatever, you can see things as just illusions, you know, like there is like kind of a resurrection sequence right before that, so that leads you to think that this is after the resurrection now, but you kind of have to just be able to like play it loose somewhat, I guess.
And I think that like, you know, the eschatological component is obviously, yes, very important because of this orientation we've spoken about and of the whole cosmos and of everything inside of the person sort of pointing to this end, this goal, this fulfillment, this finality. And so I think that, you know, if you track it throughout the film, these moments of violence or of cataclysm, like even these are the cross, I think, is hidden in this film. So yes, you know, I think there is this noticeable lack in the iconographic lexicon of Christ, and yet I think that there is this sense in which the cross is woven throughout. Strangely enough, I think even like the dinosaur sequence is really instrumental in this because there's this moment of mercy of being restored to life that's even sort of baked in there into the natural order, but that, you know, this violence and this cataclysm, whether it's the exploding of a star or of a, you know, meltdown at the dinner table, you know, that these can also be the site of grace.
Yeah, so I love this film. I told you I am still my favorite film. I think still the one big question I have about Malick in general is like, where is we come to it with the idea that Malick is a Christian filmmaker, and so he has these very general things that we then read like the full content of Christian doctrine into, right? So like The Thin Red Line is a great example of that, where it's like, I don't even know if this is like a Christian like metaphysics or not, you know. But as it goes on, he gets closer and closer to like explicitly talking about Christianity. You see that in the next films, and of course, A Hidden Life is about a saint, you know, and taking place in an explicitly Christian context, as is this film, in so far as we see them being baptized and confirmed and preaching in their church and things like that. I think I still, and it'll be interesting to look at the next few films with this in mind and see if he gets there, but. I'm still like, well, if this is Christian, then where is Christ? Like, where is the incarnation? where is the and the cross, as you mentioned. A lot of it feels like very very transcendent and very imminent, but it's almost like the place of the incarnation is like, I won't say nature because the way that term is used negatively in this film, like in creation. It's like it's like so grace is infused into creation, but where is the mediator through which grace is, and so that's the question I have about Malick in general. And I could say he's my favorite Christian filmmaker, but then like I actually watch his films concretely, and I'm like, how do I put my finger on like what actually makes this Christian? And I think that this film is clearly operating in a Christian context. His films are definitely inspired by Christianity, right? There's scripture in this. There's references to St. Augustine, the Imitation of Christ in this. The concept of grace, the concept of original sin is clearly present. I mean, we get the water snake right after the dinosaur sequence and the meteor hits the earth. We see Jack again for the first time in a while as an adult, and then we see like this water snake, so that's my open question about Malick too, is and it's hard to tell, it's like how much of it is holding back, how much of it is just that he has a very kind of like overly abstracted version of Christianity that's not like truly focused on like the person of the God man. But then in The Hidden Life, we get that question about like painting Christ. Christ comes into the fore. He writes a letter to Martin Scorsese after seeing Silence. Like, what is Christ asking of us? So it's clear that he's like getting closer and closer to the concreteness. And I have problems with the next couple of films on a moral level, but that's where we get the most focus on like, there are priests who are characters. There are, this is more and more getting close to like Christianity as a religion and not just as a general like view of that all things are shining with the presence of God in some way. Yeah. So you get what I'm saying. I can't answer the question in this, but it's interesting. And that just goes back to like the thing I keep saying, which is like the great Catholic films have like not yet been made. I still think this is probably the greatest film ever made because it has that poetic power that, even the Passion of the Christ, which is about Jesus, and it brings to the fore higher realities and more specific saving truths, this film just like is this poetic masterpiece, and it is kind of unmatched, in its poetic power, and it's Christian enough that it's not just aesthetically beautiful. It brings that poetic power conveys something that is spiritually powerful as well. So like it does reach the level both thematically and aesthetically to where I can say it's probably the greatest film ever made, even if it may be lacking in terms of like a fully Christian view or something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how, it really is, and this leaped out to me on this viewing, the pilgrim nature of the film, which is, always there, but I guess I tend to think of the next few films that are in his filmography to be they're definitely more explicitly kind of about pilgrims searching, but this one is really where it starts, and it's interesting to think of, the comparisons obviously to the Divine Comedy or to other works, how much the pilgrim journey is kind of at the heart of many of these works that we consider the greatest, I don't know, there's like something there, and I guess it shouldn't surprise us that one of the greatest films ever made is a pilgrim journey. So I have a pet theory about the last shots of these Malick films of this particular era, where they seem to be pointing to the next one, because at the end of the New World, there's this. What do we have? We have a huge tree, pointing to the Tree of Life.
Right.
If I really want to stretch it, I would say at the end of the Thin Red Line, we have the image of like the water and the life, the plant kind of coming out of the water, which, hey, the New World begins with like water and ships and,
yeah.
But I do think it's funny okay, maybe this doesn't hold up, but the way that the Tree of Life ends with this shot of this incredible bridge, which I just learned today is here in the New York area, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. I don't know why that surprised me, but it did. And the next film, To the Wonder, features heavily this question of the wonder is a man-made structure. It's Mont Saint-Michel. Now we don't see Mont Saint-Michel at the end of this film. I guess that would be.
And there's a kind of bridge.
But this idea of we're moving from, in general, from like Thin Red Line, The New World, Tree of Life, To the Wonder, we're moving more and more from the natural creation to man-made objects, to man-made structures, man-made creation. And I think there's something about the bridge kind of points to that, because that's very much going to feature not the bridge itself, but the idea of a man-made structure is kind of the locus for the meditation. And I don't know, I think there's a little something there.
That's cool. Why is this called the Tree of Life? We've never talked about the title. There are trees in the movie. It's not the last shot of the film.
True.
But we do see one pretty close to the end of the film in the Houston.
Well, I think that the tree as an image is, obviously Tree of Life is a Christian metaphor.
Sometimes viewed as a symbol of Christ. Yep. Right, in the Garden of Eden.
But then also, you talk about like
the cross.
A life has many branches, lots of different, twists and turns, but there's like a central principle. There's like a sap that flows through it all, so this connective thing that we were talking about of grace, sort of shining through everything. A life is so much of what this film is about. It's about his life up until this point. And perhaps the whole meaning of life, So I think that like all of these things are invoked by a title like The Tree of Life.
Thanks everybody for listening. Go watch this movie if you haven't already. And so, we'll be back with more Malick soon enough. And in the meantime, we'll be hitting some other things. Maybe we'll do Children of Men this year for a Christmas movie. We've been talking about that for a while. So let's try to get that in the can before Christmas.
It is.
Oh,
same DP, yeah. So we'll do that, and maybe one or two other things before the year ends, and then probably get back to Malick early in 2025. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me.
All right, Nathan, thanks for visiting. Thanks for being here in person with us. And you'll get what's coming to you. Checks in the mail.
I will get what's coming to me. Thank you.
We all do.
It's a real pleasure. It's awesome to be here in person with you. So.
All right.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.